Hello and welcome to the episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm with Forrest Anderson, who is, I forgot to ask, are you a creator or just lead developer on Veloren?
Yeah, we call it core developer.
Core developer.
Yeah.
And also I just found out he is one of the podcast hosts, or actually the podcast host, is that correct, for Rust Game Dev?
Yeah, so I co-host it with Richard Patching. And so, yeah, it's been like a really cool experience to be able to reach out to the game dev community in Rust and talk about some of the stuff there.
Yeah, I just saw your latest episode is June 6th. I think I used to listen a while back, and then there's so few episodes, and then I only listen when I'm at the gym, and gym keeps closing over here because of COVID. And I'm in Hong Kong, like one of the worst places for restrictions for COVID. So I just haven't had a chance to get back to it. But I do remember that the podcast was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think the episodes that we did have definitely hit on some really cool topics and spoke to some really cool people. It's just logistically, for us, it's a bit more difficult to pump out as much content as some of the other podcasts.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening in Rust Game Dev. I mean, maybe we can just... Actually, why don't you just quickly introduce yourself so that way I don't sell you short on anything. Because you're more than just those two, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I got into Rust several years ago. And actually, well, first of all, yeah, my name is Forrest. My tag is Angel on Fire on Discord and GitHub and all this good stuff. I'm a student at Carleton University in Ottawa, and I started learning Rust several years ago for my AI course. And through learning Rust and like wanting to try more in the game dev space of Rust, I found out about Veloren. And so I've been a core developer of Veloren for a few years now, in which I do a lot of work on our blog posts, getting stuff set up on like the Git side, a lot more of like the meta handling of the project, a lot of outreach stuff too. But then this actually sort of slingshotted me into getting more involved with the Rust Game Dev Working Group. And so I started by helping write their or edit their monthly newsletter. And then I became a team member, and now I'm one of the team leads of that. But then also I got an opportunity to help out even further in like the Rust scene with the cross-team collaboration Fun Times meetup, which is an opportunity every month for people who are working on really cool, just Rust internal things to talk about what they've been doing. So for me, I definitely love the community side of a lot of Rust. This is like, we got like these highlights of Rust features, and community is like one of the ones that's up there. And I definitely agree with that a lot. And so, yeah, sort of all over the place, a few different areas that I like to specialize in. But yeah, you're really excited to talk about Veloren today and dive in a lot more into what we've been doing.
Yeah, actually, I just want to touch on something. The one interesting thing about the Rust community is like everybody's so willing to introduce you to other people in the community. That's really interesting, I think.
Yeah, and I think this feeling was like emphasized so much to me once I got onto the Rust Zulip, which is like where all the compiler people work and all of this. And when I asked a question about Rust at universities, I got a lot of feedback from people who I had seen on GitHub as like really big contributors and stuff. And I got to work with a lot of really cool people, and everybody's just incredibly welcoming. Like I was at one of the early Rust CTCFTs, and it was a really great feeling when like someone that I had known and sort of like looked up to as like, oh, like really cool Rust contributor was like, hey, I don't know if I know you yet. Like, who are you? And like, how can I like find out more about you type of, that was like a really cool experience. And so definitely very welcoming in a lot of ways.
I did want to ask more about the Rust game dev community, because the weird part is, of course, it's part of Rust, but it seems like it's also its own thing. It's like the, I don't know, maybe not the cool kids, but kind of like the, I don't know, the dangerous kind of guys, but also the cool guys. I don't know how to explain. Like their own little splinter cell. They're in the community, but then they're also doing their own thing. It's kind of a weird community in that way.
And ironically, this is actually how I see some of the other working groups as well. So since I'm like one of the leads of the Rust Game Dev Working Group, and I have like a pretty set schedule at this point of, okay, we release a monthly newsletter, I run a monthly meetup, we do a podcast every once in a while. And so I kind of see the operations of how things work. And I'm familiar with like a lot of ideas in game development. And so nothing feels like super out of reach. And I mean, for the stuff that is out of reach, I have good contacts with the people who work on that. So for example, like with WGPU, which is a graphics API, I know like one of the core contributors, and we talk at meetups quite often. And it's like really, that is great to be internal in this community. But then when I look at like the either embedded working group, I'm like, oh, they have weekly meetings, and that's something that we don't have. And so are they more put together than us? And there's like a lot of other working groups as well. And so, yeah, I think game dev especially, I think there's actually some sides that are a little bit, it's like set apart. So for example, we have our collective that sort of puts out the newsletter and stuff like that. But there's a lot of entities that sort of stand on their own. So for example, the Bevy community does a lot of their own blog posts. They do their own game jams on a lot of this. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they're like separate from the Rust game dev working group, but they definitely have their own thing going on that like we wouldn't want to tread on the toes of and say that we're top of them or anything like that. And so, yeah, it's definitely a very diverse ecosystem. And I mean, if you go to like Are We Gaming It, you can definitely see all of these different avenues of game dev that are being explored.
Are We Gaming It? Is that run by you guys or is it somebody else?
Yeah, so that's one of the sites that we work on ourselves. And so it has a lot of different references to different crates in the Rust game dev ecosystem, as well as a lot of games that have been created. So I think one of the biggest things for Rust is just having examples of what has been possible, what has been made. And especially since there are several different game engines in Rust, being able to sort of see what example games look like code-wise is really important for a lot of people. I think there's definitely a lot more diversity in the game dev scene for different engines than you might see in different parts of like maybe the embedded working group or other working groups.
Yeah, I was going to say, I had a weird interaction with the game dev community. Maybe it's that weird. I don't know. Like, I got tagged because one of our episodes had something to do with game development, and like they added me on GitHub, and they're like, "Hey, here's your article," and I'm like, "Okay, am I supposed to do something?" Like, I literally put that on the thing. I was like, "Am I supposed to do something?" They're like, "Well, you can expand on it or something." Like, it wasn't very clear, like,
oh yeah,
what was wanted from me. Maybe you see my comment. I was like, "What do you want?"
So that definitely could be. And I feel like to a certain extent, that could just be like either a language barrier or just like talking over text. But our approach to doing our newsletter, and definitely I think hearing this feedback is very helpful, is that at the beginning of every month, we just curate a whole bunch of stuff we've seen in the community of it would be nice to have a section in our newsletter on this topic, and then ping the person who was the one to head it up. And I mean, if that person doesn't end up writing a section, then we'll go in and sometimes write the section ourselves. It's more just so you can get more people coming in. But definitely I understand like the perspective there of it being kind of like, okay, well, I got pinged. What does this mean type of thing? So yeah, that's totally understandable.
Yeah, and then like by the time I really got into it, because I was so busy, like I think it was like, oh, we're going to publish this in like 3 hours. I was like,
yes,
well, no way I can reliably give something nice in that time. But I think now if I get pinged again, I may be a little bit more on top of it, and I also have a little bit more help, so I can probably get something out there, make it more interesting at least. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe I didn't look hard enough or something, but I just didn't understand what was going on.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. That's totally fair.
Yeah, so but it's cool that you guys are putting stuff together. I mean, how big do you think the community is for Rust game development? Like both like people who are just reading it and kind of looking at it, and also people who are actually really contributing to the group, I guess.
Yeah, so I think it really depends. So like organizationally, the working group is, I think, like 10 members large or something. And some of these people work on the newsletter. Some of these people work on their own like larger initiatives. And so, yeah, like so Erlend is working on like the fish fight games, and then Reppy is the CTO at Embark. And so there's some different avenues that people are working. But what I would say is that that's not necessarily representative of the entire community that does game development work, because a lot of what is being created for Rust game development is stuff that's very, very upstream of the end user. I mean, like with any ecosystem. But the idea of building an engine, it's really fun to build an engine. There's a lot of thought that goes into building an engine, but the end goal of building an engine is that people will use it to make games. And so downstream, I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for people to start pushing games out on Steam. We've seen a few already that have Steam releases. And so I would definitely include them within this community as well. And then I guess also tooling. So we have a lot of different crates and projects that will be accessible to projects that aren't entirely written in Rust. And so a big example of this is Godot Rust. It's Godot on the front end with your Rust backend and all of this kind of stuff to a certain extent. Or I guess like Embark has this pretty cool, I forget the exact name, but it's like this networking proxy that allows you to put a server in front of your game servers and help mitigate loads on the game servers. And so definitely a lot of stuff that would be very helpful to any type of game that needs to use this type of technology. And so, yeah, I think down the line, I definitely would like to see more that's fully written in Rust, but Rust as an interoperable part of your game dev stack is really good and important as well.
Yeah, I mean, 100% Rust. I mean, there's a lot of stuff involved. I mean, you have the hands-on Rust book. I mean, there's a lot of stuff involved in that, I think.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I was like a technical editor on it, so I don't want to like plug it or anything like that, but I think it is a great way to sort of explore some game development. So The Bracket wrote this book, and it's like a way to get into Rust programming through building a roguelike game through an engine that they built for roguelike stuff. And so Yeah. And I mean, this is something that I tell students at my university too. And like when they ask, is it worth going into the game development program at Carleton? What I will say is that game development is a really fun, practical use of what you're learning in theory. And this is something that I think a lot of other subdomains in computer science might be able to explore somewhat. But if you're doing data science, I think there is fun in it, but you don't get to be the designer of something as intricate as when you're doing game development. And so I think that there's a lot of very fun exploration paths through game development for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. From what I hear, the game development is not simple, right? There's so many different things happening, and you have to be quick and patterns and all kinds of stuff. I mean, I don't want to get into it, like, but to me, I'm just thinking about, like, I understand how complicated it could be. I also understand how much game engines do help you. But at the same time, I'm like, you know what? I have no idea what kind of game I even want to make. So even if I do learn, I really don't know what to learn. And then if I even have an idea, like, I'm not artistic where I can have all these assets ready to go, and I still got to have a story. And there's so many things involved without. I think making the game is probably one of the easier parts for some things, right? I mean, compared to like a story or an idea or, all the other stuff involved with it.
Yeah. So taking a bit of a step back from Rust because I love game dev so much. I'm a TA at my university for our first year game design course. And this is something that we really have to get students to practice a lot, is understanding what game design is and what steps you need to take to build a game. And I think a lot of this is just getting a prompt, trying to make a game, learning from what you did wrong. And then another way to do this is trying game jams. And so actually right at this moment, I mean, probably not when the episode comes out, but right at this moment, the Bevy jam is going on. And so this is an opportunity for anybody to make a game in Bevy, submit it. There will be like ratings, and you'll be able to kind of check out what other people are making. You'll be able to see and comment on their games. And I think definitely when you start thinking in game design terms, it is very easy to make something that is interactive on a computer. You can make something, you click a button, it says something that's cool. It is very difficult to, as you mentioned, to start thinking with these high level concepts of like, what is the story? What mechanics are we trying to design? What do we want the player to feel and all of this? And so there's definitely a lot of different layers to it. And in any game development team, you need either someone who wears all of the hats or a lot of different people who can wear different hats.
It's just a big process. I just can't believe how complicated it is. But I guess for everything, it's always like that, right? You need a marketing team, you need a business developer, you need project manager. I mean, no software project is really simple, right? I mean, so much involved.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, but going back to the main topic, right? We're here to talk about, you said it's called Veloren, is that right?
Yeah, Veloren. And so this is an interesting title because I think Dutch and German is very similar to a word Veloren, which means lost. And so I don't know the exact lineage of our name, and we did have the name before Valorant came out. And so we definitely get confused with a few different pronunciations and different games here. But in the end, I think it benefits us. And so I'm not too worried about that at all.
Okay. What happened to the original creator, right? Is he still involved with the engine?
Yeah. So here, I'll give it like a history of sort of how the game got developed. And so mid 2018, Zester puts out a post on Reddit saying, hey, there's this game, Cube World. I really like this game, but it's closed source, built by one developer. Development is very slow. I'd love to make an open source version. Would anybody else like to contribute to this? And some people got on board, and like a first iteration of the engine was created. And so this was 6 months in 2018, from like mid to the end of 2018. And then I joined the project right at the beginning of 2019, in which a completely new like engine rewrite was being done. And so this is still the engine that we're using today. And I started with the project by contributing to the blog. I was like, okay, my Rust technical skill isn't really where it needs to be able to contribute to the game itself. And so instead, I'm just going to try to revive the blog post. There was like one blog post out at that point, and I'm like, okay, I'll do it every single week from then on. And so since then, we've had like 183 blog posts. Well, every Monday, not exactly, because sometimes I'll forget and then I'll like go back and historically write the blog post. And so I think we're probably like 2 blog posts behind right now. But yeah, so Zester is still a core developer on the project. And we've pulled in a lot of people over time that are interested in like the lineage of being inspired by Cube World, but then also people who just want to see and try out cool ideas in game development. And this really comes down to, again, the idea of who we need on the team. We need artists, we need designers, we need people who can create music, we need people who can think in terms of like very deep systems, know a lot about Rust, and then we need people who think in terms of design programming and don't need to dive as deep into our graphic stack. And so over time, we've accumulated a lot of people who also do a lot of stuff in like the general Rust community as well. And so Zestrer works on several Rust crates, some like programming language stuff, which is really cool. Sharp has done work in the like Rust Belt group, research in like the safety of Rust. And then Christoph he works in like the auto industry. And so he's like working for like the Rust safety side of things. And so, yeah, being able to just work with these people who come from a lot of different disciplines, and I mean, students as well, has just been like really great, accumulating this very large team that is able to sort of collectively work on this game.
That's a lot of different people. I mean, are they all just interested in writing Rust, or like, I'm just kind of curious about what's like the majority of people's interest? Is it just to actually recreate, what's the Cube World?
Yeah. So, and to be more specific, so Cube World, we can think of it very similar as like Minecraft. You have this world that you're walking around in, but it's a lot less focused on the building element and a lot more on the adventure side of things. And so you have like these cute pixelated characters that can go around, swing their swords at giants and do damage, and you can like go off with your friends to kill these bosses and stuff like that. And so we wanted to take a lot of these dynamics of what the world looks like, what the game feels like, and the ability to play with your friends and like scale it up a lot. And so some of like where this has worked really well is when we have our like multiplayer server. Cube World allowed up to 4 players, and maybe modded you could do more, but there was definitely restrictions on the servers. Whereas for us, we went in with the idea we want to like try to uncap this as much as possible. And so it's grown over time. We reached like 20 players online like a year in or whatever. And then we reached like at one of our release parties, 80 players online. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. And our most recent release party, we hit 275 players online. And so our goal is to get to 1,000 players on the same server at once. And a lot of optimization, a lot of work needs to go into this. But we definitely want to explore what mechanics could be added to a server that has 1,000 players on it, and like like game design, what MMO feel, all this kind of stuff. So that's one domain. And then another one is making a Minecraft-like game that looks really, really pretty. And so, I mean, the biggest example of this for me is when you're at the top of a mountain in Veloren, you can see the far off mountains in the distance. And this is something that you can't do in Minecraft because Minecraft is procedurally generated up until the point that you get to the far lands, which is very, very far away. And so you can't pre-render stuff ahead of time. Well, I guess you could like pre-render what this terrain is going to look like and then make meshes of it. And this is sort of what we do. Well, it's exactly what we do. Is we generate an island and then make a very low resolution version of it so that you can always have that low resolution version loaded in and you're able to see all of the mountains off in the distance. We recently just added a technique that allows you to see like low resolution trees off in the distance. And a lot of this, along with the weather, along with the clouds, along with like new lightning and like new audio, has really made it so that like when you're standing at the top of a mountain, it feels like you're playing a game that's much larger than other voxel games we've seen in the past. And so, yeah, a lot is coming together. And to a certain extent, it makes Veloren feel more like a tech demo that looks really good rather than something that has a lot of core mechanics fleshed out, like questing and storylines and stuff like this. But this is all stuff that we're working towards in the long run.
Maybe we can kind of talk a little bit more about what Veloren is and what it isn't, because there's so many different game engines out there, but yours is really unique, right? Because I think even Bevy, right, I think it's 2D and 3D. Like it does quite a bit of stuff. It's a little bit more flexible, but yours is maybe not so flexible, if I understand. So you use this word voxel, right? I don't think I think most people don't know what the word voxel means. I mean,
yeah.
What does voxel mean? And what is Veloren?
Yeah. So essentially we have this idea of, so a voxel is described as like a 3D pixel. And I mean, visually, we can think of it most like a cube in Minecraft or Roblox or anything like this. And the effect of it, when you start thinking about it as a pixel instead, is that it has like a lot of interesting properties about, okay, well, if this pixel is very small, then maybe you can simulate a lot of really interesting physics by breaking, like throwing a ball at the ground, and then like the ground explodes out with all these small particle-esque type things. But instead, we're not going down that path of incredibly small particles making up the voxel terrain, but instead cubes that are like, let's say like 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter type of thing relative to your in-game character. And when we think about it like this, we can start thinking about data structures that allow us to very efficiently store this data and send it over the network to players. And then also have really cool procedural generation that can happen that can make stuff look like mountains that doesn't need to have like the No Man's Sky effect where you have a lot of procedural generation, but a lot of it doesn't look so great. There might be like something every once in a while that's like, oh, this is pretty cool. Whereas pixels are like lower resolution. When you look at a voxel tree, you're like, okay, it has a cool aesthetic. It doesn't obviously look exactly like a tree, but I can tell that it is like, it's supposed to be a tree. And so when you put a lot of this together, you have characters that like are made out of small cubes. You have your weapons that are made out of small cubes, trees and mountains, and everything in a village is made out of cubes. And it gives us this really interesting look that we're able to do a lot of experimentation with. And I think, so of course, like you think mountains, there's like this generation technique called Perlin noise, or I guess randomness technique, and allows you to have, if you just mapped Perlin noise onto a terrain, it would give you a height map that looks sort of like mountains. But then we've taken this idea further and used this technique called CSG, and I'm not sure what it stands for, but it allows you to like take a, let's say, a sphere and a square and say, I'm going to subtract the square from the sphere, and now I get interesting new geometry. And then we can build like houses, we can build villages, we can build shrines and temples and all of this type of stuff out of these more procedural ideas. And it looks like what it's supposed to, but still at a lower resolution version. So I think we're very roundabout to say, just think of Minecraft cubes and what you can see in Minecraft, but it definitely gives us a lot of interesting tools to build with.
So each one of those cubes is basically, like you say, a 3D pixel. Is that basically what you mean by the 3D pixel part, right?
Yeah, so it's more like I've heard that definition before and it hasn't resonated enough to explain the full idea to me. And so I think if you've developed a voxel game and you're like, oh, it's just a 3D pixel, then it makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, if you're looking at it from the perspective of, I don't know game development at all, I think just looking at a voxel as like a Minecraft cube, and then you can make a house out of Minecraft cubes or something like that, is each cube is a voxel in that case.
Okay, that makes a little more sense. Yeah, I mean, to me, like, I've seen Minecraft and I'm like, what is so interesting about these like squares everywhere? I don't know why this is so attractive, but
yeah,
I haven't really been into video games for a long time, like, so it's hard for me to really understand, but maybe I should actually try to play one and see what it's like.
I think Minecraft especially has that feel that it's like, if you haven't like played it and explored it and understood why, then definitely looking at a game, it might not be like the most sold game anymore or something like that, but yeah, just looking at it and being like, how is everybody into this? I can definitely see that sort of point of view.
I mean, to me, it's just like 3D Mario from Nintendo. Like, that's the when I look at it, that's what I feel like, with the blocks everywhere.
Yeah.
And, you see them as 3D now. It's like, okay, this is interesting. Retro.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, I think I forgot to touch on, you had asked one question just about, and now I'm blanking as well, so maybe I'll come back to it in a little bit, but I did want to give a better answer to it. I'll think about it.
Yeah, I think the question was more like, what kind of games can you make with it? I mean, it's strictly these voxel games, right? There's nothing else you can do with it, right? It's very specialized.
So yeah, for the Veloren engine in general, in comparison to Bevy, in comparison to Unity or Unreal, I mean, a big question is like, why wouldn't we build it in Unreal? Like, Unreal is very photorealistic. It's C++, so it must be fast, and you have all of this. But with what we are trying to create, we know exactly what we're trying to make. We're trying to make a game that, if you have a whole bunch of cubes in some data structure, we want to make it as efficient as possible to send to someone over a network. We want to make it as efficient as possible for all collisions and physics. And general game engines, if we don't build the physics engine ourselves, then it's going to be insane to be like, okay, you're going to try and collide against these million cubes and see what happens. And so instead, we can use a lot of algorithms that are very specific to the use cases of you walking around in a cube world, you walking around with like networking to all of these other players. But then I think most importantly, and this is something that Bevy does do, but is having a underlying data management system sort of that allows you to be really, really optimized for your use case. And so in our case, we're using an entity component system called Specs. And this gives us a lot of capability to have, let's say, 10,000 different NPCs, players, animals, creatures, whatever, in the world, and very efficiently spread out any calculations that are done to them every single server tick across many different cores. And so Bevy does have an entity component system as well. And there's like ups and downs to using different structures of entity component system. And so ours is very specific for, we have thousands of the same type of thing, and we just want to do computation on it. Whereas something like Bevy, and I mean, I'm generalizing and I'm not an ECS expert, but from what I understand, Bevy is a lot more geared towards, we're going to have a few of many different types of things, and we're going to optimize for that. And so for Veloren in particular, specs has really given us, or I mean just ECSs in general, has given us the ability to really scale our multiplayer server past what would have been possible with a lot of other games. I mean, other languages, other paradigms of storing data. And in the long run, I think that it's going to play a small part in the parallelization of stuff like our physics systems and our just like stuff that has to happen every update tick. But it will mean that as servers scale towards having more cores in the future, we'll be able to follow along a lot closer rather than game servers that might be single threaded.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of powerful stuff you get out of Rust too, right? But I think also another nice part about using Rust is I feel like it's a lot more easier to port to different platforms. I don't know if that's true. I mean, C and C++, basically it is portable, but I don't know. I feel like there's a lot more setup involved. I mean, easier to port things using Rust, or am I wrong?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different layers within game development in particular, because with Rust, we definitely have the ability to just say, install this target and compile for it, and we're pretty much off to the races. It's a little bit less fun once we get to building for Apple, but we still have like a CI pipeline that allows us to do it. So we ship for Windows, Mac, and Linux, and we get the most downloads on Windows, but our main first class experience tends to be Linux just because that's what all our developers use. So that's one side of the equation. But then another side that is pretty interesting as well is how stuff within the graphics stack works. And the reason for this is because you have a lot of different APIs that different operating systems have. And so Windows, you have like DirectX 11, you probably have like Vulkan as well. Linux, you have Vulkan, you have OpenGL. Mac, you have Metal and Vulkan, as far as I know, and I could be mistaken with some of the specifics there. But essentially what we want to do is say, okay, we're doing a lot of very graphics heavy stuff, and we don't necessarily want to worry about all of these lower level APIs and how to interact with them and stuff like that. And so this is, I mean, like where the game development community in Rust comes back in. And so I briefly mentioned WGPU, but what we can essentially do is use WGPU as a layer to just say, we want to do these types of things with graphics. We want to have a square, we want to have a triangle, we want to have like shaders and meshes and all of this. And then let WGPU do the heavy lifting of it needs to run on OpenGL, it needs to run on Vulkan and all of this kind of stuff. And so we switched over to WGPU like fully, probably I'd say either 6 months to a year ago, I think. Before then, we were just using GFXRS as far as I know, and that the ability to use OpenGL. But moving into the future, moving to be able to support like new graphics APIs, the shift over to Vulkan has definitely been really good. And so I think the final part to making sure it's compatible on everything is the stuff that is just naturally harder to do because it's old technologies. There's like a GPU from like 2013. It might not have Vulkan support. And so I think we're still working on getting our, like now that we've moved to WGPU, there's a little bit of work to get, I think, DX11 as well as OpenGL working properly. But of course, there's also, okay, can we ship to WASM? Can we ship to mobile? And can we ship to consoles? And so WASM, as far as we looked at circa several months ago, there are some blockers just because of crates that we use that are not WASM compatible. Although this is something that we definitely want to support in the future. I mean, playing in a browser would be amazing, and you don't have to like have a launcher. You don't. Well, we do still keep our launcher for like the desktop version, but yeah, being able to play in the browser definitely helps out a lot, just like with portability. Mobile, Android or iOS, I mean, it's definitely been proven to work. I have someone who comes out to Rust game dev meetups and shows off an application called Numinal. It runs on iOS. It's really cool to see. I think it uses Bevy under the hood. And then consoles. So we actually did do some experiments with the Steam Deck. And I mean, Steam Deck runs Linux. And so it's nothing amazing. It more just taught us that we need to have better control layouts for console devices. But stuff like, I think we've run Veloren on a rooted Switch, but then Xbox, PS4 haven't looked into that too much just yet. And so overall, I mean, once the tool chain is there, then I think it's definitely a lot easier. But then you also have other, I guess, licenses you'd have to use for different consoles and stuff like that. And so, yeah, overall, there's been a lot of work going into making sure that we run on as many platforms as we can, but always room to improve, I think.
Yeah, I forgot about the Steam Deck. It's like a PSP-like thing.
Yeah, I put in my order for the Steam Deck right away, and so like it was released, and so I got mine pretty nice and soon. Definitely some fun ideas to experiment with the different way to interact with computer games. I think it's quite a fun device.
I'm kind of curious. Like, it seems a lot like a Nintendo Switch. I mean, like, what can it run? I mean, can it run most games on Steam or no?
Yeah, so it runs Arch Linux and I mean, Steam has Proton, which is a layer on top of Wine, I think. I guess a fork of Wine is a better way to put it. And that allows you to run a lot of stuff. There's still issues with anti-cheat, but specifically with the Steam Deck, I think the most interesting thing about it is that a console that you can develop on without needing to worry about any special toolkits or anything. I mean, as long as you can port to Linux, and I'm pretty sure Unity and Unreal can do that pretty nicely. Or, I mean, I guess you can just port to Windows and use the Proton layer to do some testing. But a full Arch system has a full Arch desktop, and so you're able to like SSH into it, drop your binaries on there, or just plug in a keyboard and mouse, develop the entire game on there. And so, yeah, I think for Veloren especially, it's something that when we looked at, we're like, oh, if we could try to build our own controller user interface crate that would allow you to use controller pads, but have a user interface that's much more designed around using controllers, because that's something that I guess we haven't looked upstream to see if there's a crate for that yet. It was more just talking like it would be cool to build our own. But just the way that you interact with controllers is very, very different than computers. And so, and especially the Steam Deck, it has like these interesting mouse pad type things. And so there's a lot of area to try out new things, I think.
Well, looks like I'm ordering a Steam Deck right now. It's on my list. You think it's worth it?
Nice.
This one's 5,000 Hong Kong dollar. What is that? Look at the high class one.
It came out like with shipping, everything. I think like 700 Canadian, so $600 type of thing. Yeah, I think I like going out on my hammock with it. It's a lot of fun to have like a portable thing. I took it on a trip and I used it at the airports, but not as much on the rest of my trip. And so I think it definitely like your mileage may vary type of thing. But I mean, also the fact that it's just a Linux computer is very cool.
Yeah, I might just check this out. I'm filling it out right now as we're talking, actually. Might as well check it out. So you can actually write games on this for this thing, right? It's rooted and everything, or you have to root it yourself?
Well, there's really no rooting to have. Like it boots up in SteamOS, but you can change it to desktop mode, which is just KDE Linux or KDE Arch, I suppose. And so, well, as rooted as you don't need to type in an admin username to sudo type of thing. And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of potential for it as showing off like what Linux is capable of these days, especially within the gaming scene. And I mean, with Veloren as well, like I mentioned that most of our developers are using Linux themselves. It really gives us, well, of course, we're running our server on a Linux box in Hetzner in Germany. So for us, it's much more like, yeah, I don't know exactly how to say it, but the development experience on Linux just makes so much sense for our developers. You have all of your like Rust analyzer, of course, Rust, you can compile it on Linux. And when it comes to running like our servers as well, we have, I think we pay like €100 a month or something like that for our current server. It has like 32 cores. And I don't know if we've done any specific optimizations for Linux server running in particular, but instead of like trying to provision Windows servers and saying we only have like the ability to ship like if you want to run a server binary, it has to be on Windows type of thing, which I think quite a few games would do. I'm trying to like just imagine. I guess Linux support for servers is pretty predominant as well, but yeah, definitely we try to make sure that. Well, no, we don't even try to make sure. It's just most of our developers do use Linux, and so it is the way it is.
Yeah, but I think a lot of games I like to play on Steam are like Windows only, because I'm like, oh, I miss Duke Nukem, I miss all these games from forever time ago.
So yeah, what I've found is, I mean, people ship games for Windows. It's like, especially if you're building a game in like, say, I don't know, C++ or something. Yeah, the experience to port it over to Linux can be a lot more of a hassle, because every time you have to like use a new library, you have to make sure all the like the linker stuff works. And I think, yeah, for me, like we use 800 crates and we just hit cargo run and we're good to go. And it just feels so good in comparison to when I thought back to my CMake files and C++ and everything. And I think as well, yeah, so I mean, Proton itself, there are very few games that don't work well on Proton. And so the Linux experience in general tends to be getting a lot of steam. And so, and I think, yeah, the Linux playing experience as well. Like I can look at like numbers of downloads on Veloren. I think if I had to guess, I would say for every, I don't know, like maybe 3,000 Windows installed, we'd probably get like 300-ish Linux installs. And then probably closer to like 50 Mac installs. And my numbers could be a little bit off there. Maybe I'll put that in a blog post sometime soon, because it's kind of, yeah, interesting to see the player percentages.
Yeah, I just didn't think that the gaming community for Linux would be so big, but I mean, I know programming community obviously for Linux is huge, so it would just make sense that you naturally want to make games on your Linux PC and then play them on there. So I can imagine that's probably growing, right?
Yeah, and I mean, with the numbers I just put down, like now that I think about it, it being like a tenth of the Windows players does suggest that we might be in like the false sense of security of like, oh, we're like Linux is our like first class platform. But I mean, and that being said, like what I mean by first class platform is that if there's a Linux bug, it's very easy for us to find someone to test it and get like try to figure stuff out about it. But on Windows, the biggest bugs that will come up is like someone's using a GPU that isn't new enough, or something crashes on boot because of some driver, and is very rarely, or if there is a bug that happens that causes the game to crash partway through, it's something that you're going to experience on any platform. And I mean, diving back into like some of the powers of Rust, what we've found as a project that, so last time I looked at GitHub, we work on GitLab and then mirror to GitHub, and I was looking at like number of contributors on GitHub that like carried over users from GitLab. It was about 200 developers have contributed to Veloren ever. It's probably gone up quite a lot since then. But the ability to have someone come onto the project, develop a feature, and then not have to worry about unsoundness and safety issues, and we can instead just focus a lot of our merge request review time on looking at, okay, is this done optimally? Should this be moved to a different part of the code base? And I mean, even done optimally, like you're interfacing with the ECS, which is where a lot of the performance has to be done. And so we can like pretty high level say, okay, you're adding a new sword, you're adding like this type of thing. We don't have to worry so much about it being inefficient. And then instead, when we're building like the abstractions over, I don't know, like an event bus to handle all of our audio or all of our something like that. Once we make the event bus efficient and its own type and all of this, we can be a lot more critical about that and then like really focus time on review there. And so there's definitely a lot that needs to be improved with how our code review works in general, getting more people in and checking stuff out. But it's very much something that can happen with a very quick heartbeat. We don't need to have someone onboarded for 6 months to know everything about the architecture to be able to make one small change, which I think is a really powerful feature in game development.
I was just thinking, like, you wouldn't have. This is going back a while back now. Somebody was like, "Hey, man, there's something wrong with this game on my Pentium 2." You know,
Yeah.
Won't really work on that, right? Because I think Rust can export to that, but not really supported, right?
Again, this comes back just down to like the tool chains that Rust has, and it's very much as long as your system architecture, I mean, x86 or whatever, support stuff. And we've definitely had people come in and say, I'd love to have this shipped to my Raspberry Pi so that I can like run a server on there or something like that, and set it up in CI, made sure that I think the architecture for that is like ARch64 or something. Or another better example is a new M1 MacBooks. There was, I think, Nodulus put some work into getting the toolchain like all worked out and set up and make sure that everything works, and then chatting with the team, seeing what could be improved or whatever. And yeah, for each of these, I mean, CPUs are incredibly fun. You get all of these like different commands or not commands, but instructions and optimizations and all of this kind of stuff. And I mean, the Rust and the LLVM just abstract so much of this away. Like, so I don't know how much we use that could be SIMDable. I feel like I've heard in like the last few months that it's like, oh, our CSG system and a lot of the calculations can be done in like single instruction, multiple data type of way, which means that if you have a CPU that supports these instructions, then you get, I don't want to say like 2x speed ups or something like that, but definitely some calculations can be done much more quickly. And so I know there was like Sharp did an entire optimization pass on how like some chunks are rendered or like, I guess, procedurally generated, and talking about like building the village houses out of tossing a triangle on top of a square and then a smaller square in the middle to hollow it out. Like that can be done a lot more quickly through some of these optimizations.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said the portability of Rust is quite big. So as long as you got the tool chains, you can pretty much do it. But then again, even if you get the CPU working, like you said, you guys are moved over to Vulkan, right? So if your graphics card cannot support Vulkan, then maybe you have a problem, no?
Yeah, so with Vulkan in particular, it's definitely great. So WGPU gives us Vulkan, but WGPU is also working backwards to give us the stuff that is older. And so I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I think we do have OpenGL support now, which means that pretty much any GPU should be pretty okay to work now. But yeah, again, being able to just sit on top of WGPU, and WGPU is doing great, amazing work to build a great graphics API that's successful. And I mean, so we use WGPU, Bevy uses WGPU. And so I think this also allows for, I don't know which, it's either in the browser you use WebGPU or OpenGLS, or so I don't know the exact API name, but Bevy also is able to support that. I think WGPU is as well. And I mean, at the end of the day, what this layer portability means is that any engine that is now dependent on WGPU, or any, like Nanu also uses WGPU, can just build a way to export to web. And so, I mean, Bevy in particular, like I've built some stuff like the Bevy server running and then opening up in a browser is just like so easy. So, and I mean, for a compiled language that has so much going on under the hood, I mean, it's definitely amazing to think, oh, it just works in the browser. It can just compile to WebAssembly and be off to the races. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely exciting to be part of the ecosystem that's working on a lot of this, and also know the people. And so, I mean, we talked about this earlier, where everybody in the Rust community is so welcoming. And we have like our Rust game development Discord, where a lot of discussion goes on for game development topics and learning. We have a Rust game dev meetup where I try to invite people out who are working on cool things and kind of do a show and tell each month. And I've definitely found that there are people who want to talk to one another about what cool stuff they're working on. And more opportunities to do this really can push a lot of people further. And also just giving people a platform. One really big example of this within the Rust game dev meetup is that Graphite, which is a browser-based Illustrator, like if you think Photoshop, Illustrator, that kind of thing, is being worked on. And every month they finish their work sprint right before the game dev meetup, or during the game dev meetup, I suppose. And so they come and talk about all of their updates. They encourage people to come contribute. And I think that this platform being available to help with this kind of stuff is really great to see, like the progress coming along each month. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, I definitely spend a lot of my time doing community stuff, but I feel that the investment that I put in to organizing a lot of it and setting a lot of it up, like, has returns and dividends and what I get back from like just seeing the community go forward.
I think just talking about the Rust dev community and what you're doing with that is like should probably be an episode all by itself.
Yeah.
We are running out of time, so yeah, I have another meeting to attend, as I told you before, but I think maybe it would be good to have you on again just to talk about the Rust game dev stuff going on and more about the process and how everything kind of working. I think that'd be a really cool episode too.
Yeah, I think especially if I could get some of the other people from the Rust game dev working group potentially coming out and chatting as well, because I mean, when I joined, there was already a ton of history going on in the game dev space, sort of. And so, yeah, I don't mean to say I invented anything. I'm just a mere contributor to what it has already been awesome for so long. And so, and yeah, I think game dev in particular, like, as you talked about, it does feel like sort of this island off part of Rust that they're doing cool things, but we don't really know too much about them. And so, yeah, I always love talking about it. And I'm sure, hopefully, a lot of people would love to find out more about some of the cool. And if you go to Are We Games Yet, or Are We Game Yet, just explore some of the games. There's so much cool stuff that's being built. Yeah, it's definitely a very exciting ecosystem to be part of.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of fun to figure out, like, I wonder how many different Are We Blank Yet websites are there. There's like a ton, actually. Web, game.
There's one website that, Are We Web Yet? Are We Game Yet? Are We Embedded Yet? Are We Learning Yet? Are We IDE Yet? All of this. So much cool stuff.
And there's also a podcast called Are We Rust Yet, I think, or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there is a Rust podcast called Are We Something Yet? They rarely put out episodes, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll check that out. Lots to learn.
Yeah, but like I said, they haven't put out podcasts for a while. So anyways, again, I have to run. I apologize, but cut this a little bit short. But I do want to let you kind of shout out and also like let people know how to get a hold of you and also how to get involved or anything like that with Veloren or Rust Game Dev, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have a Twitter account, Angel on Fire. I really don't interact with it too much. But if you are on Discord, you can look me up. You can join the Veloren Discord if you go to our website, veloren.net. You'll be able to find a link to the Discord. Feel free to ping me, talk to me about any questions. If you want references to other parts of game development or anything, I can do my best to redirect you to the right people. And that's the thing. I mean, all of these people, love talking to others and love hearing about like the projects they're working on and talking about it and all of this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, definitely reach out to me on Discord. More than happy to talk.
So, well, thanks again for coming on, and I apologize for pushing this off a few times.
No worries. No worries.
Back in. Okay.
All good.
Thank you.
Yeah, lots of fun.